$559 a month. That is how much Patreon support you guys are currently sending my way, and that's after the Patreon fees are taken into account. So you guys have no idea how much that means to me. There's no way Ancient DOS Games could have continued this long without that support. So thanks so much to all of you for helping keep Ancient DOS Games going, helping keep me going, and pretty much ensuring that there's going to be plenty more Ancient DOS games to come. But this video today is something that I've actually been planning for a while. We broke past the $512 a month threshold for the Milestone video I had planned back, I think it was September-ish last year, and I've been wanting to do this video since then, but I just haven't been able to find the time to fit it alongside the normal Ancient DOS game stuff. So I figured I'll make it a filler video. I've already done that once before, putting a video that I had planned as an alongside thing into the main filler sequence, just so that I could get it done, right? Because you only have so much time to do stuff. So the whole purpose, though, of the original filler that I was going to do was to have people send in questions. And my policy was that I would answer any question that was sent in. And not just any of them, all of the questions that were sent in. With just two stipulations, one being only one question per person, and the second being no questions that require a not safe for work answer. So, with those stipulations out of the way, let's actually answer these questions, finally. Fai-Din asks, will you resume development on Text Mode 2000, or at least create some new games for it? The product looks really interesting. Funny thing about that one, if I had answered this question back in September-ish when I originally planned to do this video, the answer would have been a straight no. But now the answer is more of a no for now. Like, I mean, the thing with Text Mode 2000 is that part of the reason why I stopped developing it was I couldn't really fit the original plans for it into what I was doing anymore. Because the original plan was to make games for it on a routine basis and then sell those as like microtransactions. But that's not really possible anymore. But one thing I noticed now that I've been doing programming in Quick Basic on my live streams on Sundays is that Quick Basic kinda sucks as far as making text mode stuff. Because I put together like a whole interface and libraries and everything to do the whole Text Mode 2000 thing. So making something in Text Mode 2000 would actually be way easier to do than the Quick Basic streams I've been doing. So I'm not against the idea of maybe making a game for Text Mode 2000 on live streams, but that's not on the cards yet because that would actually take quite a bit of planning to do because I want it to be something decent, not just some quick little thing thrown together. So possible in the future, but no for the present. Joseph Coco asks, with the financial success of commercial indie games in the past 10 years, do you think it makes sense to draw a distinction between indie games with a commercial focus versus those created with an artistic expression focus? I feel like several things happened at once to bolster indie titles. AAA studios using indie games to regain interest, or I think he means interest. Tools used by larger studios becoming available for free, mobile gaming taking off, Steam, etc. So it's hard to tell if wildly successful indie games were somehow different than indie games which came before, or the less commercially successful counterparts. I'm not sure you mean commercial focus versus artistic expression focus. I think you more so meant artistic focus versus a gameplay focus. Because even a highly artistic game is going to be commercial software. It's something that people are going to pay money for. So I think in terms of a distinction between artistic and gameplay focus, it's just kind of in the genre, you know? Because, like, I mean, a game that's heavily artistically influenced with very little in the way of gameplay mechanics, well, there you go right there. It's a game that is meant for players to experience as simply as possible, which means there's not going to be much to the gameplay. There can't be. But if you have a game that's more so focused on the gameplay, there's going to be rules for players to learn, there's going to be interactivity within those rules, and the artistry is still going to be there. So there's not really much you can say in terms of commercial focus versus artistic in that sense, because again, this is all stuff that's going to be sold for money. But in terms of how indie games have taken off over the years, That's definitely happened. Like, Minecraft was the one that set the stage for that. That was the game that proved, hey, maybe indie developers should be paid attention to because indie developers can actually make really good stuff. So I think that was what opened the door to indie developers having more freedom to get their stuff out there and more people noticing their stuff. But it still ultimately comes down to making a game that people want to play. So a AAA studio can do that, an indie developer can do that, and then it's just a matter of making sure people are aware of it. Luke Chang asks, how do you think about emulation versus hardware? Does it really mean that much to an average user who are interested in the topic, but not as much as an enthusiast? Not only referring to DOSBox and old PCs particularly, but in a broader sense, like console emulators, etc. My opinion on this is that real hardware will always give you the most authentic experience. Not necessarily the best experience. So when it comes to emulation, you have to consider that emulators serve two purposes. The first purpose is to be able to make it possible for somebody to play a game without the original hardware, which is kind of a big deal when it comes to any kind of DOS stuff, because the range of hardware that DOS lived through makes it very hard to have all of the hardware necessary to be able to play all of the DOS games that were out there. So for something like that, emulation is very key. And emulation even serves its purpose for console games. Like, I mean, you see companies like Nintendo putting out their NES and SNES mini things, which gives access to those games to players who can't afford to get into retro gaming anymore. Like, I mean, it's way more expensive to get into the actual retro hardware now than it used to be just 10 years ago. So emulation definitely has its place, and for one, say that emulation is something that you can use beyond that, because the other thing emulation can do is potentially improve the experience. So for a console game, this could mean like getting higher resolution out of the SNES Mode 7 graphics, or for a 3D Accelerate, or not 3D Accelerate, but for any console that uses 3D graphics, being able to get higher resolution out of that. So it's being able to play those games the way you want to, not necessarily the way they were designed to. And I think emulation is interesting for that aspect. But if you want the most authentic experience possible, you pretty much have to go with real hardware. Gary Lay asks, do you ever find the production and schedule of producing videos grueling? How do you avoid burnout? Sometimes I don't. I'm actually kind of going through a bit of burnout right now in terms of making games. So I've kind of decided that I'm going to spend like the next couple or 3 months of my spare time just playing games as opposed to making them. But I'm still going to be making videos and stuff because my mind is still pretty sharp for that right now. But then that's also why I only do Ancient DOS games 3 weeks out of every month, so that I have that extra time to either give myself a break or work on other stuff if I want to. And that's actually another interesting point there, is that Ancient DOS games takes quite a bit of effort to do just one episode of, whereas Shovelware Diggers, which I've been keeping up for a while now, the average episode of that only takes 4 to 6 hours to make. So that gives you an idea of why Shovelware Diggers can continue when Ancient DOS games only gets 3 videos a month, right? So, but yeah, sometimes you gotta take time for yourself, man. Juan Bourbano asks, is another video game crash inevitable? And if it happens, will it correct everything that's wrong with the game industry at present? There will never be another video game crash, for a very simple reason. When the video game crash that happened in North America happened back in the early 80s, that was triggered by for a couple of reasons. The first was that gaming was still a relatively new thing at the time, and still relatively expensive. The average person wasn't really prepared to go out and buy new games all the time. And the other thing that happened too is this oversaturation of games that were out there was so intense that the only way anything would stand out is if there was something recognizable to it. And one of the games that came out back then was E.T. for the Atari 2600. Now, as I've mentioned before, it's not that that particular game is bad, but it does take quite a bit to get into because of the nuances it has. But that wasn't the typical style of game at the time. So imagine you pick up E.T. for the 2600 back then when it was brand new, and you try to play it and you realize this isn't all that fun because you don't understand what's going on because the game is so different. Well, this created that whole jaded marketplace that was like, I don't want to buy games anymore. They're too expensive and they're not fun. And that's ultimately what ended up happening. And that's why there was that crash, was the saturation just set in so deeply to people. Like, how do I know if I'm buying something good or not? And you didn't have the kind of reviews back then that you do now either. Like, I mean, the example I like to use as to why there's never going to be another video game crash is Avatar. Avatar was one of the most popular movies ever. And what I would like to say is, imagine if they made a game out of Avatar that sucked. Really, really sucked. Would it kill the video game industry? No, of course it wouldn't. And that's why there's never going to be another video game crash. Because that kind of situation that occurred back in the early 80s is not capable of happening given the way the video game industry is now. Maximilian Knoll asks, so I have an old game called Nihilist, and it's for MS-DOS. It only finds its CD-ROM if I run it in a Windows 9X DOS box. Real hardware or not, both work. In both DOSBox and Real DOS, which is very strongly preferred according to the game's README file, whatever the MSCDEX driver is, or method of mounting the CD is used, after a few calls to MSCDEX's interrupt, it prints MSCDEX ? Yep, Nihilist CD must be present, and gives up. The game CD has audio tracks, and the DOSBox debugger says the game tries to read the data track as audio and DOSBox won't let him. I modified DOSBox's behavior on this part in vain. Do you know of any other games like this, or more precisely, why this might happen? You seriously used your question you could ask me for tech support? Well, the short answer to all of that is, I don't really have a clue. But if I had to guess, my guess would be that the specific version of MSCDEX included with Windows 95 and Windows 98 is probably more compatible with the game than earlier or later versions. Actually, I don't even know if there were later versions. But in any case, the point is that it's probably a version difference between the different kinds of MSCDEX out there. So that's my best guess. Matthew Belshin asks, will or would you do any more filler videos not based on PC stuff? Your love for Bubble Bobble, which I love too from the Amiga, and your Wonder Swan could make for some cool episodes. Well, that was kind of the whole point of doing filler videos, was to just be able to talk about whatever I feel like talking about. So sometimes it's PC stuff, and sometimes it's DOS stuff, but it can be other things too, so it just really depends on what I feel like talking about. That's all. CD32 asks, you mentioned once that you had a sleeping condition. If it's not too personal, would you elaborate on that and how it has impacted your life? It's not only not too personal, it's kind of required knowledge if you want to actually get along with me. The thing is that I suffer from what's referred to as a circadian rhythm disorder, also known as a non-24-hour sleep cycle disorder. Now, the idea is that the average person, they go by a certain rhythm. Like, their body wants to be awake and be asleep at certain points in time, and those times tend to follow a particular pattern. Now, things can get out of whack for the person because they go to bed too late one night, or things get shifted around because they're doing shift work, and now they're suddenly having to go to work and come home at very different times and everything. But ultimately, that person can get into a sort of rhythm and schedule. My body is not capable of doing that. I don't have that rhythm to help maintain that. So the points in time when my body wants to be awake and asleep can vary dramatically, leading to really crazy hours sometimes. Now, fortunately, it's usually predictable to a degree, but there is still some randomness to it. So just because I wake up at a particular time one day, I may end up waking up like several hours earlier the next, or several hours later the next, so it can be very tricky to plan ahead because of that. And not only that, it can be very tricky to just do anything that requires like maintaining a schedule or something. So, needless to say, that made it very difficult to hold jobs. This is something I've been dealing with since, I think it was early 2000 when this started happening to me. It's been tricky. And the thing is, I've tried going to doctors, I've tried, like, I've seen some, how many specialists was it? I think it's like 3 different specialists I've seen, and part of the problem is that there isn't really a lot of research on this particular condition, because most of the people who suffer from a circadian rhythm disorder are also blind. They can't see the sunlight, which means their body can't synchronize to that. So that's why they have the problem. And the irony to that is that when I was actually trying to seek disability support, I never got it, but when I was trying to seek that, my doctor was like, well, I need you to try a light box first. Like, get some simulated sunlight going, see how that helps you. Yeah, like a light box is going to be any brighter than that thing. Parafine asks, how did you create the show intro, and in particular, the awesome animated overlays? I think you already did a filler on the Patreon outro, but I don't recall something for the overlays. But if you already answered that, please disregard this question. So the original intro is actually took several programs to put that together. It's done with TrueSpace for the 3D aspects. Though I'm probably going to use Blender in the future, just from the fact that TrueSpace can be difficult to work with. And once I had just the normal animation going, the next thing to do was to break that down into 16 colors, specifically the EGA 16 color palette. And I did that with a combination of an old copy of PaintShop Pro 7 that I'm still using, and the animation shop program which came with that. And then once I have it down to 16 colors, it's just a matter of putting all the extra bits to it. And I just do that with PaintShop Pro, fill it in there, and then render it all together using a combination of Virtual Dub and FFmpeg. Though on top of that, when you're referring to the actual overlays that show up in the videos, that's actually just static images drawn together in PaintShop Pro 7 that are then just made to move and transition on the screen in various ways using my video editing software. And I currently use Sony Movie Studio HD Platinum 12, which is a fairly old version. I haven't updated just from the fact that I've tried 13 and its user interface was terrible. So I haven't really had much of an opportunity to update from that, but maybe sometime in the future. Yarmaranta asks, which of your songs you're most satisfied with and why? Actually, there's a whole bunch of music I've been working on that none of you have heard yet, because I've been saving it for one of my game projects to come up. So the music I'm most satisfied with is stuff that is still pretty much private for the moment, but hopefully someday I'll be able to share it with you all. Eric Hancock asks, what is your favorite tool for developing retro-style games? I don't really have a favorite tool per se, because when you're the only person working on a game, you pretty much have to use all of them. And regardless of which tool you're using, it's work. You don't really have that much fun doing it. So I don't really have a favorite when it comes to tools for doing that kind of work or anything. But I do use quite a few different programs, and I think I've talked about that before, but it's a lot to list, so I'm not going to do that right now. By the way, I should point out the camera glitches are from the fact that I'm using my webcam right now because of the sunlight outside, so please ignore the camera glitches. Larry Thomas Davis asks, what kind of job do you have? This job. No, really, Ancient DOS Games is basically my primary source of income right now. And I know looking at the number that I get from Patreon support doesn't seem like it should be enough to live off of. You gotta remember that I'm not living on my own right now. I currently share an apartment with my father. Now, it's not me living with him so much as it is he's my roommate. So we're actually splitting the costs fairly evenly on things. So that drives the living expenses way down. So that's what's making it possible for me to live off of that. But the other thing too, though, is that I have actually had like normal jobs in the past. By normal, I mean like jobs that weren't me doing my own thing. Like, back in 2002 was when I got a programming job doing math software. And that's something I've discussed before. And that was something that lasted 2 years. And I learned a lot about the educational software industry during that time. Because it's only a small company, so I reported directly to the CEO. But the other job I had was a call center job. In 2009 was when I got that job. And that lasted until about mid-2010. I actually have a funny story about that, and that's going to come up later on in this video. Rob Caporetto asks, considering you've done it in the past, would you ever consider going back and coding a new DOS game after all this time? I don't really know how DOS compares for new old game releases, but it's something which is increasingly popular for other classic home computer platforms. Simple answer, no. And the reason for that is also very simple. If you go back and try to make a DOS game, you're basically intentionally handicapping yourself, because there's only so much you can do with DOS. Basically, if you want to make something and you want your creative vision to be able to be done however you want it to, you pretty much have to use something modern, like a modern API or a modern game engine or something. Otherwise, you're limiting yourself. And that isn't necessarily going to produce what you want to produce. Now, it can be challenging to do that, so if you want to go back to a DOS environment for the challenge of it, then by all means. But if you're trying to make something you intend to sell for profits, you really should stick with something modern. Pixel Diva asks, what about doing this show do you enjoy the most, and what really aggravates you? Funny thing about that, I can actually answer both parts of that question with the same answer. The comments. People leave all kinds of comments, and the best ones are when somebody talks about how I've reminded them of a particular game, and how just seeing that nostalgia coming through, like people really enjoying reliving those past memories of the games and everything. But then at the same time, sometimes people leave really aggravating comments, like as if they didn't watch the video or don't understand my opinion, or are suddenly angry at me for their misconception of my opinion. Or sometimes people leave comments that are just derogatory. It's not like they're trying to be constructive or anything, they just want to be mean. So yeah, that's the part about making videos that I both enjoy and hate, is dealing with the comments. Robert Mackey asks, is there a particular game that you have memories of from childhood, but ever since you've never been able to identify what game it was? Or if not a game, then a film, TV show, or book. Okay. There's this one game I have distinct memories of from childhood that I have never been able to find any information of. Not even back when I was trying to look for it, like in the late 90s. But in any case, it was a Windows 3.1 game, it was a dungeon crawl, and what I remember about it is it had a fully black background. The walls for the dungeon were a solid red, like not even textured. And what was weird about it was the dungeon was actually rendered in the bottom left corner of the screen, as opposed to like the bottom right or the top right or any of that. And there were stats around the other edges. I remember there was a lot of blank space on the screen. So, despite the fact that it was rendering the dungeon in the corner, there was still like a border around everything that was just black. And I think the name of the game had the acronym LOL, or possibly LOD. I think it started with an L, but I don't remember exactly, and I might even be wrong about that. But I have never been able to find any information about this game. Like, even back in the 90s when I tried to look for information about it back then, I couldn't find anything. So there's a possibility that I was actually playing somebody else's development stuff, because this was not on my own computer, this was on somebody else's computer, and it was somebody I didn't really know much about. It was like one of my mother's friends or something. So it's very possible it was something that this person was actually making themselves and then never released. But at the same time, maybe it was a fully released product or something. One other thing I do remember, though, is that the game was unfairly difficult. So that's also what kind of leads me to believe that maybe it was something that was still in development. Jim Leonard asks, do you feel older computer games should be judged relative to games and platforms appropriate for their time period, Or should all computer games be judged against each other equally regardless of time period? A particular focus, gameplay mechanics. Technically both, but it also depends on why you're judging the game. Like, there's a couple things I try to keep in mind whenever I'm talking about something on ancient DOS games, and that's the quality of the game, as well as the relevancy of going back to it nowadays. Now, in terms of just the overall quality of a game, that's something that should be judged versus how good the game was when it came out, like what it was competing against and the other games that were out at the time. Now, some people would argue that whenever you're talking about like an old DOS game, you should only really compare it to other DOS games and not to other games on other consoles, because the markets supposedly didn't compete with each other, except they did. Like, I mean, consoles were way cheaper than computers, so chances are if you wanted to play games, you probably had a gaming console of some kind. So there was absolutely competition between both PC games and console games. But that's what I try to keep in mind whenever I'm looking at an old DOS game, is how good is that game compared to what else you could purchase at the time. But that's only half the story. The other half of the story is going back to it nowadays. And that's when it becomes necessary to consider just how much gaming has evolved since then, and whether or not it's good to go back to a game because it's still fun to play and fun to enjoy, or whether it's more so just to get the nostalgia out of it. Like, I mean, a good example I like to have here is Wing Commander. Wing Commander is a game that was phenomenal for when it was released. It had these cinematic sequences to it. It made you feel like you were part of this game world with this ship that was going through the Kilrathi space and everything, trying to survive in this war. And that was great. But if you try to go back to Wing Commander nowadays, all of the technical issues are going to rear their ugly head, like the speed variances that you can never really totally compensate for, and the unresponsive controls, and the hit detection being wonky as hell. Like, these are all things which turn you off of wanting to play the game. So it's more fun to go back to that game, not so much to enjoy it, but rather to re-experience it, bask in the nostalgia. Whereas something like Doom was revolutionary when it came out and was pretty fun and really interesting back then. And even nowadays, if you go back and play the original Doom, it's still fun and still enjoyable because the mechanics that are there still work from today's perspective. So that's something you can go back to, not necessarily for the nostalgia, but just to enjoy it. So that's where the distinction lies. When it comes to gauging the quality of a game, that should be done versus what was available at the time. But in terms of gauging how the game should be gone back to nowadays with a modern mindset, then obviously you want to take a more modern look at it. Henning Thordblad asks, I've always looking for new music to fill my playlists with, and I kind of get the feeling we're similar in taste. So if you had to make a top 5 artist band list, what would it look like? You know, reading this question is kind of reminding me about how Patreon supporters come and go, because that was a question asked by somebody who isn't a supporter anymore. But maybe they'll support again in the future. I don't know. Everybody has their reasons for pledging support or leaving support, so I am not one to judge for any of that. But to answer the question, if I had to make a top 5 for favorite artists or bands, it would actually probably look something like this. I know, it's all video games. That's the only kind of music I listen to is video game music. The thing is that my favorite kind of music to listen to is music with no lyrics. I don't like lyrics in my music. Period. So that's why video game music appeals to me so much, is because it typically doesn't have lyrics. And whenever there are lyrics in video game music, I don't like it. So that's why my picks would look something like that. Like, I don't even know, like, so many different artists and bands. Like, I don't even think, if you played a song for me from like a popular musician, I would have no idea which musician it was. So I even have trouble identifying some of the older stuff. So yeah, that's what it would look like. Jonathan Gosselin asks, how did you get started in programming and then into game development? Funny thing about that, it's actually the opposite way around. I got started into game development before I learned how to program, because I have been making games since I was 5 years old, but I've only been programming since I was 10. So how does that work? Well, I started out making card games, dice games, board games, the kind of stuff that you don't need a computer to do. Just some imagination and pencil and paper, or the cards or the dice, or some other existing board game. That was actually one of the things I like to do a lot, was take an existing game and repurpose the rules into something way different than was originally intended. Like, one of the famous examples I like to point out is I once turned Scrabble into a platformer. I am not even kidding. So it wasn't until sometime in 1992 when, at least I think it was 92, when it was 93. It was early 1993. I think it was grade 5. And I was living in Texas at the time, because Dad was living in Texas at the time. And at the school we were at, there was a computer that we got in the classroom, and nobody could figure out how to use it. None of the kids could figure it out, not even the teacher could figure it out. So one day I got my work done early, like really early. So there was a lot of the class time left, so I asked the teacher, could they use the computer? So here I am sitting at this computer, and I'm like determined to figure out how to use this thing. So I'm going through the manual, doing what the manual is telling me to do, and that's when it started to dawn on me. I was literally telling the computer what to do. And so from there, I figured out how to make the computer do the things I wanted it to do, not necessarily what the manual wanted it to do. And then that ultimately led to me making like a random number guessing game, and I impressed the heck out of everybody in the classroom with that. So one day when I got home, I'm thinking to myself, that thing's called BASIC. I wonder what would happen if I typed BASIC into the command prompt on our Tandy 1000 computer. And sure enough, a BASIC environment loads up. Yeah, that pretty much set my course for the next decade or so. Since then, I've learned other programming languages like Pascal, C, C++, and all kinds of stuff like that, but that was how it all began, was a little basic computer in the back of a grade 5 classroom. And the final question from Martin Hirschberg: what made you want to make your first video? Were you already programming at the time but decided videos might be more fun? Do you play old DOS games seriously as one would a new game that just came out, or is this more of a research project? What did I say about asking more than one question? Actually, that does kind of all tie in together, so I'll let it slide. But the thing is, what made me want to make my first video was, after seeing how not well my software was selling after releasing Super Minesweeper and Pixel Ships Retro, I was thinking about different ways of going about just getting people interested in what I was doing. So, inspired by videos such as James Rolfe's Angry Video Game Nerd videos, I decided to try and make my own videos. And I think maybe a total of like 8 people have ever seen the original attempt at ancient DOS games back in early 2008 on game trailers. Yeah, not a lot of people have ever seen those, and probably a good thing because they kind of suck. But what it taught me at the time was my hardware was really underpowered for doing videos. Like, I was still using my old Windows 98 system. I was using free video editing tools, which were terrible. It was hard just to get one video made. So, yeah, that wasn't so fun. But then something happened during my call center job. Around the start of April 2010, I ended up getting laryngitis, and it didn't just take out my voice for like a little. I was totally unable to speak for like a month. And after the first few days of that, I started to realize this is not my future. Having this call center job is not going to last, so I'd better start thinking about where I want to be when this ends. And that's when I considered maybe I should give my Ancient DOS Games series another try. But instead of trying to be like somebody I'm not, try to go at it at a perspective that's more so how I would normally be. Because my original attempts at doing Ancient DOS Games, I was trying to be like force humor in there. It didn't sound natural at all. Like I said, I'm glad it's disappeared from the net because I don't think anybody should be subjected to it. But I decided to take my own approach. I wanted to be more of myself in the videos. So I had a Windows XP computer then, so I did my research, got some good video editing software, and did all the work necessary to get Ancient DOS Games relaunched, and then in May 2010, that's when it happened. So, well, after I got my voice back. I probably would have started it sooner if my voice came back sooner. So there was actually a point in time when I was doing both the call center job and Ancient DOS Games, but that didn't last long. The call center job only lasted another couple or 3 months before that didn't end well. But in terms of playing DOS games for research or fun anymore, doing Ancient DOS Games as a full series like this really has worn on me a bit. Like, I almost never play DOS games anymore just for the fun of it, only just to work on the episodes, which is kind of disappointing for me. But I do have some ideas about how to revitalize that whole thing for me so that I can have fun playing DOS games again. And I'm not going to spoil what I have planned for now because it's something I plan to get into come the next year for Season 6 of Ancient DOS Games. But yeah, something to look forward to is there's going to be some new and interesting ways of doing the show going forwards. I'll let you all speculate what that's going to be for now, but trust me, it'll be good. Anyways, I've been recording for, it says, actually, almost exactly an hour. So I have no idea how long a video this is going to be, but as I said at the start, I was going to answer all of the questions that were sent in. That was all the questions that were sent in. Some of them from Patreon supporters who aren't supporting me on Patreon anymore for whatever reason, which is totally fine. As I said, people come and go, and sometimes they come back even. But just to celebrate the fact that so many of you are pledging support, I am now going to list every single person who has a public pledge going. And by that I mean somebody who's decided to actually have one of the reward tiers, because, as you guys know, all of the reward tiers include having your name potentially show up in the credits of videos. But there are a few people who don't do that. So you guys are not going to be on the list, you guys will stay private. For everyone else, here you all are, and again, thank you a ton for all the support you're helping to give to me. Alex, Anders Peterson, Andersej Polis, Anthony, Arborus, Baroka Sides, Artisan Tulsar, Brandon Thomas, Brian Edgar, Brian Kitchens, Caleb Bott, Cameron Spry, CatDog Joe, CD32, Charlie Hankin, Chloe Kitty, Christopher Groff, Chromet, Desmond Von Heerden, Dick DeYoung, Dominic Renaud, DOS Nostalgia, Doug Holmes, Dookie, Eli Malinsky, Eric Pidkameni, Boone Turing, Gary Lay, Guillaume Bourbonier, Hobified, Horikawa Otane, Ian Cassidy, IS4, J.A., Jacob Dimmick, Professor Renderer, James Dunn, Yarmo Ronta, Jason Crooker, Jesse Cook, Jim Leonard, Jonas Mueller, Jonathan Gosselin, Joseph Coco, Justine Toplin, Juan Burbano, Christian, Kuma, Lothazar, Lee Norton, Lenoir, LGR Lazy Game Reviews, Luke Chang, Madame Crystal, Martin Hirschberg, Matt Naraki, Matt Taylor, Matt Howell, Matthew Belsham, Maximilian Knoll, Medic Finland, Michael Madsen, Michelle Semp, Olaf Albean, Parafine, Patrick Wong, Paul Shearer, Phi Din, Pixel Diva, Pushing Up Roses, Retro Warlock, Brendan of Retro Swim, Richard Monfort, Rob Capretto, Robert Mackey, Roy Taylor, Rune Fox, Scott, another Scott, Scott Percival, Sean Mativer, Seth Tierney, Shake Your Bunny, Sean Wren, Simon Ashtier, Some Regrets, Space Quest Historian, Spree, Stephen Conklin, Stuntaneous, Terrence Steel Dragon, The Great Code Holio, Tim Coyne, Tim Lay, Tim Worthington, Tortoiseshell Jenny, Tyler Knott, Victor, YOLO 2000, Zed Supremus, Zoltan Zelnek. Thank you all for your continued support of Ancient DOS games and shovelware diggers and whatever else happens to come out of my head. And if you're a little disappointed that you can't be on this list right now, just remember that there's all kinds of ways you can support the show. You can either just talk about it on social media, or even just watching the videos on YouTube just generates ad revenue. So you don't have to be on this list to be somebody who cares about what I'm doing. This is just the people who are supporting me on Patreon, and if you want to do that, that's fine. If you don't want to do that, that's also fine. And there's other ways you can support me too, either by purchasing the games that I have on my website or making donations on my live streams that I do every Sunday. It's however you want to support the show. So anyways, that's all I have to say. I hope you guys enjoyed my answers to these questions, and I will see you guys in whatever video I happen to do next. Take care, everyone.